Hi, I'm Bryce Crittenden.
Hi, I'm Caroline Land, and welcome back to EPL's Overdue Finds.
Caroline, really over the last year or so, we've got to do some really cool things with the podcast and talk to some really interesting people.
Absolutely.
We interviewed Mindhunter author and retired FBI agent John Douglas. We interviewed former death row inmate and who's part of the new movie Just Mercy is about him, Anthony Ray Hinton. Former WWE superstar and concussion expert, Dr. Chris Nowinski. And today, following that tradition of speaking with forward-thinking speaker series presenters, we are interviewing the mayor, Mayor Don Iveson.
I was really looking forward to this, and I was really excited by how excited other people got for me when I told them I would be interviewing the mayor. There was a high level of excitement for us to have this conversation.
It was interesting because we actually got to interview him in his office, where kind of in this big round table, and like a lot of decisions are being made here. And then we ask him about Star Trek, and I bring up Mayor Diamond Joe Quimby from The Simpsons with him.
It's a classic Overdue Finds episode.
It really is, yeah. So we hope you enjoy this interview with the mayor, because we touch on quite a few topics ahead of his forward-thinking speaker series event with us on January 30th called Building a City for 2 Million People. We talk about what it really takes to possibly build a city for that many people in the future, as well as some of his pop culture picks as well. Before we get to the interview, I'm going to share a very funny story after everybody gets a chance to finish listening to this interview, because if you would have asked me a couple days ago what my most embarrassing moment was, I don't know if I'd be able to give you a moment, but that moment happened during this interview, and I'll share that with listeners after we're done listening to this.
So make sure to stay tuned.
Definitely. In the meantime, please enjoy this interview with Mayor Don Iveson. All right, Caroline, we're so excited because we're in the office of Mayor Don Iveson, who's our guest today. Welcome to Overdue Finds. How are you today?
I'm well, and I don't think I have any overdue books right now.
Well, that's good.
I
should have maybe checked.
Hope I could say the same. I'm not sure.
I got a warning about one of my books the other day.
But we're not here to talk about that.
We are not, no. So today we're talking about your upcoming forward-thinking speaker series presentation with us on January 30th called Building a City for 2 Million People. And you have a couple of Edmonton's top young leaders joining you on stage. How important is it for you to be including some of those younger voices in this discussion?
Well, I think it's critical when we're looking out 30 years to bear in mind, not just sort of generically, but really personally, that we are making decisions today that will affect people who are young today, who will be, our age, middle-aged in my case, when those decisions come to fruition 20 to 30 years from now. And so I think keeping an intergenerational lens on all of the big decisions that we make here at City Hall, that's been something that's been important to me. I was elected to council at 28 when the average age of council was in the 60s. Now it's much younger. This is the youngest big city in the country, and so I think it's still important for us to bring that long-term and intergenerational view to the stage, and I'm really glad that Robin and Kaylin are going to be part of the discussion on the 30th. And Kaylin in particular, I've had a chance to work with before because she used to be the chair of the City of Edmonton Youth Council. So she has, for several years, been interested in these questions and been a part of making submissions to City Council, a part of our planning and public engagement around a lot of our long-term decisions. And so for someone who is 21 now, she's already got years and years and years of engagement and understanding of some of the complexity of what we're dealing with. And here's the cool part is she's decided to pursue a career in city planning, which is really, really cool. So I'm excited to hear from her and reconnect with her a little bit. And I think Robin's got some great perspective about the social diversity of the city and how the city's changing as well, and through some of her work. And so I think having both of them part of this discussion is only fitting, and I take that intergenerational perspective now. Like, I think all the time about the kind of city that we're building for my son who's 10 and my daughter who's 7. who will be, kind of my age in 30 years? And are we building the kind of city that they're going to want to choose against all the other places they could be in the world? Are they going to choose to want to be here? So I think it's critical that we have young leaders engaged throughout these processes. And some of the most moving stuff that we learned from our public engagement was from the engagements with City Hall school students and young people who were talking about the city they imagine they want to live in. And it's very, very uplifting. And it just helps us maintain that long-term focus.
What do you think is the most important consideration, or maybe some of the important considerations for Edmonton to grow as a city of 2 million and thrive as a city of 2 million people?
So I think it's a question of opportunity and cost, and not just in the strictly fiscal sense, but there are a lot of opportunities as the city grows and a lot of costs and complexity as the city grows. And we can just kind of let it happen. We can kind of let it unfold on roughly the trajectory that it has for the last couple of generations. And that will have certain costs, I think, and cut off certain opportunities. And so strictly speaking around infrastructure, a more spread out city has a lot more roads to build and to maintain and to plow. And that comes at a cost. And then also having more people traveling greater distances on those roads who are more likely to be car dependent in a spread out city, strong correlation to that. You're also going to have worse traffic congestion. And that traffic congestion comes at a cost to people in terms of their time. And to air quality in terms of the emissions, and to public health, because car dependency is strongly correlated with poorer population health outcomes, which is bad for productivity, which is bad for your economy. So you can also deliberately build a city up that is more energy efficient in terms of its housing, because more structures share walls. And are cheaper to build, and is also indirectly more efficient in terms of less linear meters or kilometers of infrastructure, whether it's pipes or roads or sidewalks. Very tangible things that have a real cost. And then also that more compact city again tends to have a lower emissions footprint, tends to be more walkable as well, and so you get those stronger public health outcomes. But you also get in lots of places that are built up and a little more tightly knit, you get stronger social outcomes as well, stronger sense of connectedness, lower crime, lots of other positive benefits. So I think if we're intentional about building the city up for those next million people, we can avoid some of the challenges that cities like Austin have encountered, for example, where a lot of cool similarities between our cities. Culturally and economically in terms of the arts and innovation. But that city really harnessed that effectively, kind of doubled in size, didn't build a big public transit backbone, which is still controversial here, but and didn't really enhance their public transit system. Now they just have a giant traffic jam. And that's a limitation on their next stage of success. So I think learning from those challenges that other cities like us have encountered, and then planning better and getting those better economic outcomes, those better environmental outcomes, and those better social outcomes is kind of the opportunity of a lifetime. So those are some of the key considerations.
Nice. So you've been mayor since 2013 and started as a councillor in 2007. When did you realize that you wanted to get involved in civic leadership? And was there anything else that maybe you wanted to do or be when you were growing up?
Well, when I was really little, I wanted to drive freight trains. This was going to be my calling in life. I had a model railroad. Railroading's kind of in the family a few generations back, and so trains, naturally, that's what a 3-year-old wants to do. Of course, a few years later, I wanted to be an astronaut. This is what, in the early 80s, this is what kids wanted to do, or at least me. And I have a fond memory of taking out the Space Shuttle Operator's Manual from the Southgate branch of the public library so many times, because I was trying to learn how to fly the space shuttle at 6, that the book actually fell apart. It was a soft cover. It just wow. Died. And a few years later, when I was, after several years on the library board in my time on city council, I was presented with a pristine new copy of the Space Shuttle Operator's
Nice.
Manual, which I still have. So if I want to go back to to astronaut, that's, it's probably getting a little bit late for me. But the decision to enter public life in 2007, running for city council, goes back to 2002 and a public policy forum that some friends of mine organized. And there were a lot of ex-student leaders. We'd all kind of retired out of Students' Union and campus newspaper and campus leadership stuff, and we were all finished our degrees and kind of trying to find our way in the world. And there was this public policy forum that was running for 3 years. First year they talked about the brain drain, and one of their recommendations was we need to build better cities if we want to keep Canadian talent here. And so the second year and this was when I got involved, the big question was, what do we need to do as a country to build globally competitive Canadian cities, especially with regards to maintaining and then attracting new talent to big Canadian cities. And I got really, really interested in these questions. And it sort of started me on a journey that led to me running and led to me doing this with the encouragement of my wife and some friends of mine and some people who I'd met through this network as well, actually. And the final report from this 2002 effort, which is called Building Up something, but it's out there, it's online. It was put together by Canada 25. The final report was written by a guy named Nahid Nenshi, who you may have heard of. He runs another Alberta city of some repute.
Yeah, kind of a big deal.
But he and I are both trying to implement the consensus findings, in our own local context of this effort from almost 20 years ago now. And it was great thinking. It's a great read, and I think it's still relevant today. And that's an example of, I kind of went on a whim, actually, and I'm really grateful that I did. And it's also an example of, planting a seed with young leaders and then seeing that develop intergenerationally as we went from young leaders to being, in charge. Right?
Yeah.
And so that was a big part of the journey.
What other advice might you have for young Edmontonians who are interested in getting involved in civic issues?
Well, I think, like I was mentioning, this Canada 25 thing, I kind of found out through a friend and went on a whim. And I could have just as easily said, I want to go to the lake that weekend or something. And I think that was actually a choice for me. And I went to the public policy thing. So not everyone's going to make that choice, but particularly for people who want to have an impact on their community. And I think some of the young leaders I see today are really profoundly interested in community and really profoundly interested in the world and issues of justice and issues of climate and environment and biodiversity and want to know where to plug in. And community, and at the city scale, is a great place to do it. And so say yes to those opportunities when a friend, something comes across the table. And then through those things, and I ended up getting a little bit involved in Canada 25 and doing some volunteer work with them. And so between that, my community league, and a bunch of other things that I just said yes to, I, not on purpose, because I wasn't trying to build a political machine, but I built a network of people who knew that I cared about stuff and who cared about a lot of the same stuff, and who would, we'd all have thoughtful conversations about these things and try to figure out where are we going to take action to have impact on this. And that was how I built, not on purpose, but kind of by accident, a network of people who ultimately were some of the folks who encouraged me to run and who were there for me to be part of my campaign. And I will always say that the more people you have in your campaign, the further you can make the financial resources go. And it's a basic formula of money times people. And so we had a lot of people because of showing up. And that even in an age of social media and technology and all the rest of it, there's still no substitute for a strong network of people who can help you in something like this, and who want to have an impact through you. So finding those people and saying yes to those opportunities and volunteering for their causes and being engaged in their leadership, supporting their leadership, is a way to have impact in the community, and maybe have through that have the opportunity to come forward for public service.
Yeah, it just kind of goes to show how important networking really is. So we've just entered a brand new decade, of course, and it's been very turbulent last few years, I think we can say, but what are some of the biggest challenges facing Edmonton as we begin 2020?
So there are really two that I've been reflecting on a lot over the last year and even over the break, and they're related. And one is a question of economic inclusion and economic anxiety. A few years ago, there was some data that the OECD was looking at cities, and Edmonton had one of the largest, if not the largest, middle class of any city in the world. And that's part of the security of this place and the community of this place and the promise of this place. It's pretty flat, but there are still increasingly in this economic climate people who feel on the margins of that. And there are people who felt on the margins of that intergenerationally because of systemic bias or issues of racism or other barriers to their participation in the economy. And then there are people who have only just started to feel alienated from the prosperity that this community thinks of itself as having because of the immediate economic downturn in oil and gas and manufacturing and related sectors. And so there's short-term, recent, and intergenerational economic anxiety. And people who are on the margins, short or long term, feel these downturns harder than everybody else. And so I think that remains a work that through End Poverty Edmonton and our work around homelessness at the most extreme edges of poverty, where we remain committed. But this now urgent political question of the alienation of people who have done very well in the energy business for the last several years and who are now feeling that economic anxiety, I think that is a real concern and pressing issue, not just in Edmonton, but across the prairies and across resource communities, not just in Canada, but around the world. And that goes to the other change, which is the way the world gets energy and uses resources is in some kind of profound transition right now. And that is related in part to policy levers that are being pulled, whether it's carbon pricing or whether it's emissions caps or whether it's fuel emission standards or green building requirements. There are policy levers being pulled and investors who are concerned about environmental, social, and governance considerations and fairness and justice increasingly. And so you've got institutional capital changing where it will put its money. You've got all these global forces that have a lot to do with climate change and the environment, sustainability, and justice and fairness that are changing the way the world gets its energy and resources. And those two things together can lead to a lot of anger. And we've seen that flare up in 2019. And anger is kind of a natural response to insecurity. But we need a better answer than anger to square the circle of how do we achieve our emissions goals so that we can have quality of life and an economy and prosperity a generation from now, because we're now talking about fairly near-term risks around climate change, while making some kind of economic transition that doesn't leave a whole bunch of people behind, and ideally actually brings more people in who've been marginalized historically in the economy. So I think figuring out the energy economy integration rather than seeing these things as at odds or irreconcilable is kind of the big challenge of this decade. And if we don't get it right, that has huge implications around emissions and around climate. And if someone else gets it right and we're sitting on the sidelines, kind of being upset about it, then we're going to be buying all our solutions from someone else, and we'll be even angrier. And so I think, we're green building problem solvers, we're advanced manufacturing problem solvers, we're health and bio and food problem solvers. And so we should be leaning into where we can grow the economy, create more jobs, create more prosperity in these areas, while at the same time contributing to solutions to these climate and biodiversity challenges, these justice and inclusion issues here and abroad. I think that's a very Canadian response to this challenge, a very Edmonton response to this challenge. And I think the leadership to thread that needle, not just at City Hall, but across local governments and across communities and research communities, business communities, faith communities. I think that's the big work of the next decade. And I'm really pleased that some of my colleagues across the prairies here, we've come together through the Western Economic Solutions Task Force to look at the complexity of some of those issues as local government leaders, because I really think that city halls and town halls, we're not perfect, but we're better at depolarizing these complex and emotional and fraught issues than provincial and federal governments, which tend to polarize very easily. Mm-hmm. And so I think that really the third question is leadership through these complicated issues, and that we need it now more than ever in this decade.
So much like your presentation with us on January 30th, that's why it's so important, of course, to be including some of those younger voices in those important discussions. So before we wrap up here today, we have some fun questions that I've been really excited to ask you about.
Just for the record, I thought the last questions were fun too.
Yeah. Nothing wrong with those questions. But
these ones might
would be light.
A little lighter.
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly.
Fire away.
Yeah.
So this one this one I've really been dying to know. So when you're out in public, how often are you approached by people asking either when their street is going to get plowed or when a certain pothole is going to be filled in?
So directly, very little, in fact. And this is different than my experience of being a city councillor, when people will come up to you at the grocery store and tell you exactly what they think and demand immediate results for their tax dollars, on their street, in their community, and they feel quite entitled to speak fairly abruptly to their city councillor. And occasionally people take that approach with me as mayor, though I've found that I think the office still commands a certain je ne sais quoi. I don't know, but there's a bit of respect for the office still, and so people don't necessarily bring their stuff that way to the mayor. They bring it to us very directly through social media and through other channels, and sometimes people will say one thing very pleasantly to my face, and then a few minutes later I find out indirectly what they really thought, and that's okay. People should have strong feelings about their city and deserve answers to their questions. But what I find is that, particularly on the train, because I take the LRT a couple days a week when I can, when it works with my itinerary, and people first of all are kind of shocked to see me on the train, and then once they get over questions about the logistics of my day and how I get around, then they ask really interesting high-level questions. So the mayor doesn't get the street-level questions as much. The mayor gets the, why do we do it this way? I don't understand this. And so there may be a concern there, but there's also some curiosity there. And I love, sharing the complexity of our asset management issues with people and our fiscal policy over time. And the answer is usually, as with this podcast, a little bit longer than what people bargained for, but almost universally people are like, I would never have understood that it was that complex. And then people are relieved that their leaders are engaging in that level of complexity on their behalf, right? Because there usually is more to the story, right? And so I love having those conversations with people. And if they do have a question about a pothole, I got 14,000 people I can get on the phone to get the answer from.
Yeah, exactly.
And a really good team in my office who take a lot of constituency inquiries and help people get those answers.
Great.
Nice.
A few years ago, you dressed up in costume, Star Trek costume, at the Edmonton Comic Convention.
Please, it's a uniform.
Oh.
You adjust your glasses.
Do you have a favorite Star Trek series or character?
Well, I've gone through a bit of an existential crisis on this question myself, because I was just old enough to be raised on the original series in reruns back in the mid '80s, before The Next Generation came out. So I really strongly identified with, Kirk, Spock, and Bones, and just loved everything about the show when I was a kid. And I was never quite sure how to feel about TNG. And I used to kind of make fun of Captain Picard's leadership style, because he was always asking for advice, and he had like a therapist sitting right there next to him on the bridge, holding his hand through all the hard decisions. And then now everything we know about leadership that we've learned in the last few years, from Brené Brown and from others, is that like the swashbuckling Captain Kirk heroic leadership model is completely played out. We don't need any more of that. As fun as it is to watch on TV, The strong leader whose strength comes from their team and from asking for help and from showing some vulnerability and quoting a little bit of Shakespeare here and there, like, that's what we need way more.
Yeah.
so I've really come to appreciate, as I season in my leadership, I've really come to appreciate Captain Picard and the next generation.
Nice. So are you aware that there's going to be a new Picard series starting soon?
I am keenly aware.
Nice.
Yes, I'm very excited about this.
Nice. So from Mayor Diamond Joe Quimby on The Simpsons to President Josiah Bartlett on The West Wing, there's been some great fictional politicians. Do you have a favorite?
That's a great question. I really like Mayor Carcetti from The Wire, even though he's awful. I think that show really tells a story of the complexity of what happens at the city hall in the context of the complexity of a community, in this case Baltimore. And even though he's kind of a tragic and flawed figure and kind of annoying, I also identify with the challenges that he faces, and the way they manifest that in the show is great. And then Kelsey Grammer also, I don't know why I'm going with these dark figures, but Kelsey Grammer plays a character in Boss, who is the mayor of Chicago, and I can't remember his name, but it doesn't matter. He's just Boss, and he runs Chicago with an iron fist, and it's an example of the strong mayor model, which is very different than the weak mayor model, which I don't love the name of, but it's a very different governance system. So I'm not allowed to be the boss of Edmonton. There's no structure for me to be the boss of Edmonton, but this is kind of this King Lear figure running Chicago, who's also tragically flawed, but just fascinating to watch.
What do you love about Edmonton?
I love lots of things about this city, and when you ask people, they name lots of different things. People generally include the arts. People generally include the river valley, and these happen to be two of the things I love about the city the most. My dad was a sculptor for many years, and so I just took for granted that everybody got to grow up around the arts community and, running around at shows at Latitude 53 with the other kids, sneaking food and beer and whatever, so the arts is one of the things that really breathes life into this city at all times of year, from festivals to a reason to go out and be in community in the wintertime, and be inspired by your fellow Edmontonians in some way. And so I think the arts is one of the things that I really love about this place. The River Valley as a place, and it's just lovely to be in nature. But it also has, I've now come to appreciate these really important ecological functions in our community, and these really important historic significance to Indigenous people and to the history of the economy of this place going back hundreds and thousands of years. And so there's a mystique to the River Valley as you learn more about its significance to Indigenous Edmontonians that adds an extra layer of appreciation for me. And so, and then you put it all together. I mean, what I love about Edmonton the most is, how we relate to each other here, the way we come together for each other in times of crisis, as we've seen even this month after the tragic events of the plane crash and the huge loss of life in not just the Iranian Canadian community and the university community, but it's felt as a loss to Edmonton and a loss to the country. And so the way the city comes together during those times is also what makes the joy possible the rest of the time at the festivals and when the sports teams are doing well, and just when you're on the skating oval down at Victoria Park in the winter, or riding your mountain bike in the summertime in the River Valley.
So with us, of course, being a library podcast, we, of course, always ask our guests on every single episode what a recent overdue find of their own is. So do you have a recent book, movie, TV show, or maybe album that you can recommend to our listeners?
Absolutely. On the theme of challenges and the need for leadership, I'm reading Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, Leadership in Turbulent Times, which seems appropriate for the dawn of this decade, which is just an amazing study of Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, FDR, and Lyndon Johnson's leadership journeys as individuals, and then compared and contrasted against each other and against their times. And it's just a really, really extraordinary read.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time, and we're really looking forward to the session on January 30th, Building a City for 2 Million People.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Caroline, big thanks to the mayor.
Yes, it was great talking with him.
Absolutely. He was very generous with his time. He brought up some really great points as far as engaging younger Edmontonians in, these important talks about building our city for the future.
Absolutely. And I was really struck by how he talked about not just building the city for the future, not just figuring out how to make it all work, but how we can really thrive. So it's not just that we're existing, but that we're really succeeding and have a city that goes beyond, just being okay for the people who live there, but making it the destination so that people want to stay or come back and be in Edmonton with 2 million people.
Interesting points he made, because as somebody who grew up in a smaller city, it's funny because when I grew up, I was like, oh, I can't wait to get out of here and do this thing. Like, living in Edmonton is fantastic. So it's interesting to me, coming from a smaller center, to hear that, younger people today, we want to kind of have them think like, this is where I want to stay. I want to build my career here, raise my family, or whatever that looks like. But, to have them want to still make Edmonton home.
And be part of what it looks like. Be part of the process of figuring out what it's going to be and how to get it there. I really enjoyed listening to him talk about how he got politically involved, coming out of university, getting his the conversations and figuring out where he wanted to focus on. And with the experience, he referred to Mayor Nenshi. It's almost kind of like this origin story for the mayor in a very cool way. And it'll be really neat to see what the Edmonton 30 years down the road is too.
So as a reminder, Mayor's event with us is taking place on January 30th, and of course it is called Building a City for 2 Million People. It's taking place at Trifo Theatre at MacEwan University, and we still have a very few limited amount of preferred seating tickets available. Our general admission is sold out, but with your preferred ticket, you do kind of get front of the room access and tickets to a post-event reception with Mayor Iveson.
Now, at the start of the show, Bryce, you teased a story for our listeners.
I did. As I mentioned before, we've been doing Overdue Finds for about 1.5 years now. We've recorded over 50 episodes if you count all the bonus stuff. And for whatever reason, the interview you just heard was actually the second time we interviewed the mayor. So we had our time with him, and I think I was nervous because I knew we only had a limited amount of time, and we, of course, wanted to be respectful of his time.
And as you mentioned, we were in his office.
We were.
Which you're trying to take it in, but not look like you're taking it in.
Pretty much, yeah. He has a very cool office, by the way. So we get about 3/4 of the way through. It might have even been like 90%.
It was 90.
Yeah. And for whatever reason, I happened to look over at the computer that we record into, and I realized that I did not hit the record button. I felt terrible. So I had to interrupt him mid-sentence and admit to him that I've just kind of wasted 20 minutes of his life.
I was really concerned. When you interrupted the mayor, I did not know what you were going to be saying, where this was going to be going. You were very apologetic about it and just couldn't believe it was happening.
Yeah, and by the way, the mayor So credit to him. Big thanks to him because he gave us some extra time for us to re-record pretty much the entire interview again. And also thanks as well to his member of his communications team, Nathalie, who also was very gracious too, and kind of was able to find us that extra time to chat with the mayor about that. So. Yeah. First time ever in Overdue Finds history, but I've talked to a few people about it, and they say I think that is a fairly common podcasting mistake.
Yeah, and so we've had it. It's happened, and now we move on and make other mistakes.
Yeah, naturally it had to happen with the mayor. So.
Yeah, but
it's just me and you, Caroline. Who cares?
we'll just start over again.
Exactly.
We can talk about The Simpsons any day.
Yeah.
So, Bryce, what are we going to be talking about on our next episode?
It's kind of interesting because on our next episode coming up on the 31st of January, we are going to be talking about time loops. So think of the movie Groundhog Day, if you will, where there's been quite a few movies, books, TV shows, and episodes where basically your protagonist is stuck in this time loop and they don't know how to get out of it, or maybe they have to solve something in order to get out of it. So we're going to be joined for the very first time by librarian Katie Terzansky. And I know she's a big fan of kind of time travel, time loops as well. So we're going to have some fun talking about that. And I just hope we don't get stuck in a time loop during that episode.
Well, if we do, we'll have an expert with us. Maybe she can help us get out of it.
Exactly. And hey, speaking of time loops, if I had a time loop, I would love Groundhog Day to go back and fix that recording snafu with the mayor.
Oh, I don't think it works that way, though.
I don't think it does, but that's okay, though. Big thanks once again to Mayor Iveson for being very gracious with his time and chatting with us for this interview. And of course, as I mentioned, tickets are still available. You can go to epl.ca/speaker series and grab those before they're gone.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Make sure that you're subscribed to Overdue Finds so that you get all of the new episodes as they're released. Please also leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. We love getting reviews. And if you liked the show, make sure to tell a friend about it.
And of course, don't forget that we'll have a link to everything that we talked about on today's episode, including some great picks from Mayor Iveson. It was really cool, Caroline, to hear that he really is a big Star Trek fan. So if you want to share your thoughts about today's episode, email us at podcast@epl.ca or hit us up on Twitter by using the hashtag EPL Overdue Finds. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.